Now that the dust has settled on the most recent installment of The Mandalorian and we're 3 seasons deep, it's a good juncture to take stock of our current state of affairs for the little green enigmatic creature known as Grogu. What is he doing here and what will his future hold? Will he be the unlikely hero to restore the franchise to its former glory? Or will he even be given something befitting a story as such at all? But first off, how did we get here in the first place? Because when Season 1 and Season 2 aired, they were the most in-demand shows worldwide. And to take a moment to appreciate why that was, it partly comes down to its premise, which was a coming together of the old and the new. That is, the Western genre set in the galaxy far, far away that you've wanted to return to since you first became a fan. With the Western part comprising our Lone Ranger protagonist, Mando, traveling dusty, rocky planets such as Navarro and Tatooine, seeking bounties and acquiring new gear. And it was a fun show, not to be taken too seriously. It was the perfect example of why the Star Wars IP has so much inherent value built into it. Based on the explorative, episodic nature of the show, it can be forgiven to a certain degree for not having much of a story. But at a certain point, a compulsion arises in the viewer to see some semblance of narrative take shape. And this begins when our protagonist falls under unlikely circumstances, in an event that is set to transform him from a seemingly one-dimensional mercenary into an adoptive father figure. And so the tiny, cute baby Yoda is yet the powerful lever that drives the entire story. But accompanying a bounty hunter isn't the safest place to be for a toddler, and the creature is shrouded in a mystery that needs solving. So we have the premise set for a story to establish itself as Mando attempts to take Grogu home, whilst fending off the remnants of the Empire who are also seeking Grogu to fulfill their own agendas. And in this mission, Mando succeeded, as Season 2 ends with Grogu under the care of Luke Skywalker. That is until Episode 7 of the Book of Boba Fett, where he leaves and returns to his adoptive father. At the time of watching this, the decision to revert things didn't sit right with me, but I thought, why not wait for Season 3 and see how this all plays out? And, well, it just doesn't look right at all. And it's more than just a case of wasting precious screen time to start an arc, only to then revert things back to the way they were before. But I'd like to demonstrate these major flaws by making a comparison that has surprisingly more in common than James Earl Jones and Disney, albeit a very different Disney. That is, The Lion King. So to begin this comparison, let's take ourselves to a place where, like Grogu, Simba has witnessed a tragedy, the death of his father Mufasa, and after running away from his traumas, finally collapses in the desert, resigning himself to a tragic fate. But along come Timon and Pumbaa, who save him and go on to teach him the carefree lifestyle of Hakuna Matata. Similarly, we see Grogu thrown off his course of becoming a Jedi when a spanner is thrown in the works in the form of Order 66, and he too ends up moments away from succumbing to a sorry fate. That is, until he happens upon refuge under the protection of Mando, who goes on to become his parental figure. In the case of Simba, we see his past return to him in a calling to return home, first from his love interest Nala, but when that fails, he reunites with the wise shaman Rafiki, which is a union that can be likened to Grogu and Luke. With the guidance of Rafiki, Simba has a profound experience in which he encounters the ghost of his father. In the iconic scene, Mufasa tells Simba,
"You have forgotten who you are."
And again, we can liken this to Grogu literally forgetting his Force abilities and repressing memories deep into the unconscious because they hurt so much. Mufasa instructs Simba to have an introspective experience and reconnect with his destiny, telling him, "Remember who you are," and urging him to embrace his destiny and reclaim his place as the rightful king. In the case of Grogu, the idea of remembering who you are ties into reawakening his abilities with the Force, and it's even referenced in the story where Luke tells Ahsoka, "It's not so much I'm teaching him, but more so he's remembering." These are relatable stories of a calling to turn subdued, unrealized potential into actual, realized potential. And they're both stories that, despite struggling and wanting to run away from a traumatic past, and perhaps some mistakes you made in recent years, or time you've squandered, you can still be redeemed, and that makes the call to adventure and growth that much more compelling. Simba is spurred on in the pursuit of his destiny, but after the initial high of meeting his father, begins to hesitate, rationalizing all the reasons he should reject the calling and remain in his new life he has become accustomed to, stating, "Yeah, but it's not easy. I know what I have to do, but going back means I'll have to face my past. I've been running from it for so long." But this is suddenly interrupted with the intervention of Rafiki, whacking Simba over the head as if to say, "Snap out of all this nonsense. All this overanalyzing is doomed to render you paralyzed." He tells Simba to take the lessons from his past and move forward. This finally ignites Simba with the courage to not be beaten by his hesitations and fears, and so off he goes into the night to realize his grand calling. And there's something archetypal to the story of Simba that causes an intrinsic resonance, without having to be explained. It's worth noting that Rafiki acts as the catalyst and guidance Simba needs, and so Grogu, being a toddler, will also need some kind of guidance too. So let's see what he gets. So the story did make a concerted effort to see him return to the path of the Jedi. Mando goes to the trouble of striking a deal with Ahsoka to help her defeat Morgan Elsbeth so that she will see to it that Grogu gets his training. And when that fails, Grogu himself reaches out to Luke on Tython, ultimately succeeding in finding a new master. And once they are united, there is a strong implication that Grogu is on the right path, as we see him in a training montage with an uplifting soundtrack of him remembering his Force abilities, in a sequence that seems symbolic of him no longer succumbing to his past traumas but instead reawakening his dormant potential. The practice of meditation also signifies development, as does the fact that he can now finally actually talk to someone, as the Force means he can have a dialogue with Luke. This not only acts as a means to flesh out Grogu's character, but also a means to overcome his past traumas in a form of talk therapy. So the importance of having someone to actually communicate with really can't be understated. But of course, we did a 180 from the path of the Jedi, and the Book of Boba Fett ended with Grogu abandoning the Jedi and being deployed to a war zone where he would reunite with Din Djarin. And Season 3 of The Mandalorian picked up with the same Grogu and Mandalorian dynamic of the prior seasons. So how and why did that happen? And how do they justify that from a writing perspective? In terms of an explanation for this from the show creator, Jon Favreau just merely offers us the rather obscure statement, ultimately it just wasn't his path. The first major indication that Grogu would deviate from the way of the Jedi was hinted at by Ahsoka, telling Grogu directly,
"I sense much fear in you."
She also declares that his attachment to Mando is the reason that she can't train him because it makes him vulnerable to his fears and anger. Now, I'd like to point out here that Mando very aptly states in response to this, all the more reason to train him, of which Ahsoka doesn't really have a good rebuttal but instead continues her monologue, stating that she's seen what such feelings can do to a fully trained Jedi Knight. That Jedi Knight being Anakin, who was once Ahsoka's master. Okay, so there's a massive implication that attachment is bad, as Luke goes on to echo the same sentiment, and this idea of attachment being problematic becomes the key driving factor which diverts Grogu from the course of the Jedi and seemingly renders him at risk of falling to the dark side. So seeing as this becomes the pivotal factor, let's take a moment to do a deep dive into this attachment thing and ask ourselves, why exactly is attachment so bad, and where did this idea come from? So the idea that attachment is problematic was first introduced by George Lucas in the prequels and used as a plot device as to why Anakin became Darth Vader, and not really explored much outside of that. And because it's not all that fleshed out, it becomes a contentious point in the Star Wars community regarding what exactly is the truest interpretation of Lucas's writings, and or the extended Star Wars universe. So instead of falling into that pitfall, or just blindly accepting the idea as an audience, why don't we dig a little deeper to the roots of the idea of attachment being a bad thing? Because neither Ahsoka or Luke actually offer up a real explanation for poor Grogu or us the audience. So why did George Lucas say attachment as such is bad? Well, it's no secret that he was heavily influenced from some of the Eastern religions. The practice of meditation, the master-disciple relationship. We can liken the Force to Qi in Buddhism, Tao in Taoism, but also the Holy Spirit in Christianity, just to name a few. And the idea of Force sensitivity can be tied to the idea of awareness, with the Jedi being likened to these transcendent beings, at least in terms of the ideal that they're striving for. To see more clearly why attachment is regarded as wrong, consider the analogy that you have a thorn stuck in your foot. To remove the thorn, you may consider using another thorn to pry it out. But once it has been dislodged, both thorns should be dropped simultaneously, or you risk having the other thorn getting stuck in your foot next. In this way, every tool can be considered a thorn. It can serve a purpose and prove useful, but be careful because you can get attached to it, and you must remember it is still a thorn. So attachment can be considered this rigid, binding, and preventative structure that inhibits growth, because the whole idea of Taoism is that it is an infinite, undefinable free-flowingness, or simply the way of things. The moment you have begun to conceptualize it, you've reduced the infinite to a finite quantity of knowledge or a system, and you can get the impression that everything fits into your system you built. And then you form an attachment to these systems because they give you a sense of security and ego that you have things figured out. This all becomes a crutch that prevents real growth and understanding. And this was a trap that the Jedi regularly fell into, as their hubris led to their downfall to a certain degree. Even Yoda, after all his training and studying, fell prey to this. In Season 6 of Episode 12 of The Clone Wars, he stated,
"Mastered my weaknesses and conquered my fears. I have."
Have you?
This was an arrogant statement by Yoda, but he later realized that this was still his dark side speaking in a cunning way, and manages to learn from this, stating, "Recognize you I do. Part of me you are, yes, but power over me you have not. Through patience and training, it is I who control you. My dark side you are. Reject you, I do." Here Yoda made the mistake of believing he could turn all chaos into order, but later learned not to repress things away where he could barely see them, but would still have a hold over him.
The beast is you, and you are the beast.
To deny it simply gives it power.
An idea also akin to the Jungian idea of the integration of the shadow, whereby you bring the dark parts into the light of consciousness instead of suppressing it and pretending it doesn't exist. The more you repress the shadow into the unconscious, the more of a demon it becomes. In the context of Star Wars, we could imagine this would unfold in a trip to the dark side through arrogance and hubris, whilst also being consumed by the idea that you are the perfect symbol of righteousness. It's a message that even if you are far on the path of the Jedi, the dark side may yet still have a means to convert you. And it makes for an interesting villain story as it displays how sometimes what separates a hero and a villain can be the most minute of details. So to avoid falling prey to attachment, instead of believing you can turn all chaos into order, accept that there is chaos everywhere, but despite that have the courage to step into the unknown, remain secure in insecurity, be comfortable in vulnerability, appreciate the eternal mystery of the world, and to paradoxically feel like you have everything without possessing anything. In the context of interpersonal dynamics, the Jedi were not allowed to marry, yet feelings were considered natural, and the Jedi were supposed to love everyone and be compassionate above all else. And to state that in a more widely applicable sense, you can look at any relationship as such as a stagnant binding thing, a sort of social contract, whereas the act of relating is a free-flowing way of being. Anakin liked the idea of a relationship with Padme more than actually relating to her. So now we have the reason why a relationship is considered an attachment and why attachments are considered wrong in certain religious and philosophical teachings, at least based on my interpretations and understandings. So now apply this back to Star Wars, we can say that in the case of Master and Padawan, the disciple should not be attached to their student-master relationship because ultimately that will inhibit them, as there comes a time when they themselves should become a Jedi Master. The teacher and teachings are both useful and to some degree necessary, so they should be utilized, but ultimately both must be allowed to drop away. So in our Mando-Grogu dynamic, this would mean it's okay for Grogu to love his adoptive father, but he should transcend the father-son relationship, grow up and learn to be independent. But of course, no such explanation is offered to Grogu. Instead, we hear Ahsoka state to him directly that she senses much fear in him and declares in his presence that his attachments make him vulnerable to his fears, so it's better to let his abilities fade. With this, we've established that attachments aren't something to overcome, but instead a hard and fast stipulation that even if a toddler is attached in some way, they are irredeemable, as attachment is destined to lead them down the dark path should they continue their journey. So they should give up, wither away, and die instead of training. But this doesn't even make sense. Babies are born with attachment as they are absolutely dependent on their caregiver to survive. And fear may prove useful in preventing them from walking into the jaws of a beast and getting eaten. Grogu would surely have died if it were not for Mando. And if you were to take a second to imagine you had Jedi powers, what would you do? Would you just let them fade? Seems a rather unreasonable thing to expect of anyone, really. Anyway, we continue to see a similar story with Luke, not training Grogu to overcome his attachments. What he does instead is something akin to tapping into, not the Force, but his inner psycho-jealous girlfriend who asks her boyfriend of 2 days to choose between her or his dog. And this comes in the form of Luke issuing young Grogu an ultimatum with the choice of a lightsaber, signifying his commitment to the way of the Jedi, but with the cruel implication that he should never see his adoptive parent again, or the armor, which would mean forsaking the Jedi Order.
In the story of The Lion King, Simba was not without his troubles. He was hesitant, doubtful. He had made mistakes and was attached to his carefree life. But Rafiki helped him find courage to face his troubles and fulfill his destiny. Whereas in the case of The Mandalorian, good Master Luke subtly condemns Grogu, pushes him away, and sees no responsibility or obligation towards his student, expecting him to make serious decisions with little to no guidance. Which makes you wonder, what exactly is the point of training if not to overcome hindrances? Besides, Grogu's long lifespan means eventually he'll move past his attachments to a degree as time passes. The lessons will come for him whether he's ready for it or not. Ahsoka and Luke's ideas on attachment are really a rather nasty insinuation that the Jedi should be cold and devoid of soul, indifferent towards the feelings of others, because that is attachment, and in this way you can nonchalantly throw the word around everywhere. Don't be attached to beating the Sith. Don't be attached to seeing planets getting destroyed. Be indifferent towards all suffering and just be an empty void. It's a stupid interpretation of this attachment thing. And so the Luke we see, even though it's rather brief, is a far cry from the Luke of the original trilogy. After all he's been through, he lacks compassion. Even he himself had sympathy for his father after all the atrocities he committed. He himself never had to distance himself from his loved ones. His teachings go against the very spirit of his story. In the case of Grogu, it's particularly insidious because really the implication is that because of his traumatic past of witnessing a massacre of his friends and loved ones before his eyes, that trauma has compromised compromised his purity and sparked his descent to the dark side, suggesting that the traumatized are destined to either helplessly wither away or become evil. It makes you wonder, what exactly do they learn as a Jedi? Are they just indoctrinated into a silly dogma without even knowing or understanding why their rules exist? Perhaps in some cases, but Luke was our protagonist who trained under Master Yoda. You'd expect at least a little wisdom somewhere. In an interview, Dave Filoni stated, "Luke is the one person continuing the legacy of what it means to be a Jedi, and perhaps improving on or having a new perspective on what it means to be a Jedi, compared to the prequel Jedi. But what is this perspective other than one of negligence and a subtle disdain for the impure? There's no sense of evolution or learning from the past. There's no sense of duty and commitment towards others or to put things right." Now, if we take a moment to take a step back and look at the entire overarching narrative of it all, it only looks worse. So, like Filoni pointed out, there aren't exactly a great many Jedi at this time. We have Ahsoka, Luke, and 0 disciples. The Jedi Order is in need of being rebuilt, and Grogu has already been accepted into the Order and begun training. This was of course a huge commitment on the part of his teachers, because despite their efforts they likely wouldn't even be alive to witness him flourish, given how slowly he ages. And if that wasn't sacrifice enough, they also sacrificed their lives to save him too, as Grogu watched on helplessly as they were blasted to ashes. But as the innocent and defenseless survivor, Grogu yet endured as the small ember of an all but extinguished flame of the Jedi Order. And with that, the stage was set for a powerful Phoenix rebirth story, as the essential essence of the Jedi could go on living through him. It presented an inspiring narrative opportunity, a tale of a lost child left shattered following the massacre of his people he called family, leaving behind deep scars of trauma. And the prospect of witnessing this cute yet deeply wounded child summon the courage to confront his painful past and prevail over his inner demons held the potential for an inspiring story of resilience. And it would be fitting to go from Yoda training Luke to Luke training baby Yoda. It was a good story, it was the right story, it was the way the winds were blowing, yet it was squandered totally and utterly. Grogu was being actively hunted by the Empire, so was in need of learning how to protect himself. Additionally, the Sith had a history of recruiting Force-sensitive individuals who were rejected by the Jedi Order, by leveraging their unfulfillment and turning it into animosity towards the Jedi, and cultivating dark side powers. And it's known Grogu is gifted, so why the risk of the dark side claiming him? But of course, Luke is indifferent as to where Grogu holds his allegiance, and feels no obligation to uphold the wishes and sacrifice of his predecessors. Instead, he coaxes Grogu away. Neither do you get any sense from Grogu to owe the Jedi something for their sacrifice, so his old masters could go on living through him. But instead we see him revert to an innocent, mischievous toddler, as if the events of the past never occurred. So it would be remiss to think of Grogu the Mandalorian as a trailblazer forging an unconventional path, because thus far he is shown to act out of desire to cling on to comfort and not grow up. So let's take a look at how this played out during Season 3. With a deviation from the way of the Jedi, Grogu is back with Mando, and Episode 4 depicts him on a beach by himself, not doing much. He can't socialize, of course, because he can only communicate effectively with Force users, and so seems solitary amongst his new people. And with nothing to do, the story struggles to find a purpose for him. So Din Djarin picks him up so he can begin training in the Mandalorian way. And with some darts around his wrists, you can tell that it's a combat style that seems ill-suited to him. Surely his time would be better spent learning the ways of the Force. Additionally, this episode reveals that Grogu is still traumatized, as the armorer apparently has an aura that just triggers PTSD and also seemingly never runs out of Beskar, the rarest metal in the galaxy. But Grogu's trauma isn't addressed in any way, and this just serves as a means to create a flashback to flesh out his story. And once it's over, he reverts to an innocent child again, and we're supposed to forget about his traumas until they choose to make them relevant again in the future. So much of Grogu's scenes serve as a constant glaring reminder as to why he shouldn't be there. The Mandalorians and Grogu also have opposing philosophies when it comes to beasts and creatures. Where the Mandalorians might try to kill them, driving almost all the mythosaurs into extinction, Grogu has animal connection abilities to calm them, and potentially tame the mythosaur currently lurking in the depths. Again, we have a reason why the Jedi school seems more befitting for him. So the ways of the Mandalorian don't seem appropriate for Grogu, and he has turned his back on the Jedi. So let's look at one more theory, dark side Grogu, because perhaps his stint as a Mandalorian is a temporary one before his descent into the evil ways. As we've seen, fear and attachment are paths to the dark side. It also appeals to those who seek the easy path,
the fast path, and those who are prone to the allure of temptation. Well, Grogu does live for transitory hedonistic pleasures, even going as far as to steal sweets and eating unborn children of one of his acquaintances. We've seen him use a dark side ability, Force Choke, on Cara Dune. Then of course there's Ahsoka and Luke's maltreatment of Grogu, making them look like their own kind of evil that pushes Grogu away from the Jedi and towards the dark side, in an arc that would signify him losing the battle with his past. Because not all stories have to have happy endings, but I am incredibly doubtful this would actually happen. Not least because the Sith and the Empire are Grogu's enemy. They were responsible for massacring his friends and teachers. They have also captured and tortured him. But the other reason this just won't happen is that it goes very much against Grogu's cute image. And that cuteness seems to constitute what the writers deem to be an essential part of Grogu's bewildering, interchanging character, suggesting that they are indecisive as to who or what Grogu is. Take any individual scene in an isolated context and you will always come to a different conclusion regarding Grogu's character. Is he a mischievous child? A cute and innocent toddler? Is he helpless? Or is he a capable and competent fighter? A traumatized victim? Or a courageous hero? We see him regularly depicted as cute, innocent, and naive, whether it be curiously observing and interacting with the world around him, playing with toys, being rocked in the arms of supporting characters, showing shyness and fear of monsters lurking in the dark, making cute noises, causing mischief, pursuing transient pleasures, not quite understanding that you need money to buy stuff, and also seemingly being incapable of distinguishing friend from foe in the case of Cara Dune in Season 1. So it looks like, despite witnessing the atrocities of Order 66 and his adventures with Mando, he hasn't matured in any way. But it gets inconsistent, because on one hand we've seen him not quite strong enough to rescue Mando from the cyborg creature in Episode 2, yet previous episodes have seen him take on much more formidable enemies, such as the Mudhorn in Episode 2 of Season 1, which was supposedly when Grogu was in a weakened state as well. When it's time to fight, Grogu won't be left alone with the children, but will join the Mandalorians on their dangerous missions. Mando himself takes no issue in bringing Grogu along to fight space pirates, despite Grogu not having the capacity to help in any way whatsoever, in a sequence that sees Mando outnumbered
10-1.
But despite this, Grogu is just chilling like it's a regular day in the office and enjoying the sights of the bad guys going boom, giving a whole new meaning of bring your kid to work day. But it seems like this was done because they just didn't know what to do with him.
Hang on, kid, we got pirates.
Episode 3 of Season 2 is an example of what the story can get done without Grogu in the picture, as Mando drops Grogu off in daycare while he joins Bo-Katan to seize weapons from an Imperial freighter. But Season 3 tells us it's too awkward to keep putting Grogu in daycare, so whether it makes sense or not, we'll just have him join the adults on missions now instead and hope that the audience don't ask any questions. They go about this in part by spending a ridiculous amount of screen time spanning episodes 1 to 7 just to put Grogu in the droid IG-11, despite us witnessing it being blown to shreds in Season 1, which then in turn prevents Grogu from being so cumbersome to the story, because it means he's apparently now eligible to join in on missions. The same thing plays out in Episode 7, in which the Mandalorian children stay at home during the dangerous mission to reclaim Mandalore. But sure enough, however, toddler Grogu joins in on the fun, not just to lend a hand, but to commit several remarkable feats too. First, when Mando is in danger, Grogu splinters off from the others, implying negligence on the part of the Mandalorians, or incredible stealth abilities on the part of Grogu. Then, Grogu manages to bypass seemingly impassable barriers, and where Season 1 showed him not able to follow simple instructions with red and blue wires, following Grogu's infiltration mission, he then masterfully executes intricate battle maneuvers with IG-11 using the power of just 2 joysticks to save Mando. But then, despite having IG-11 to walk around in, he seemingly doesn't need it at all because he has the ability to walk, run, and jump just fine anyway, and ultimately shows he's rather capable with the Force, using Force abilities to save the day, which also again serves as a reminder as to how essential the Jedi training is to him. And once the missions have been completed, Grogu can once again regress to being an adorable baby in a constant cycle of nonsensical growth and regression. It's as if Grogu has spent too much time watching TikTok videos of people faking dissociative identity disorder and wanted to copy them because he thought the disorder was really cool and trendy. But he's since been faking it so long that he's even managed to convince himself that the lies are actually true. Well, probably beats any explanation the writers will give us. However, really it seems that the inclusion of much of Grogu's action sequences are there to simply provide him with an illusion of relevance, without him truly being indispensable to the central narrative of reclaiming Mandalore. It's also a continued indication as to how he failed in his arc, so is now instead in the backseat of someone else's story that he really doesn't belong. It all feels so contrived. One second he's a hedonistic, mischievous child, and the next he's an adept Force user. But how can he be so strong when he's also shown as being immature and lacking discipline? A question to which no answer is really offered other than him possessing significant genetic potential. That is, he has a high midi-chlorian count, and is also the same race as Yoda, a species that lacks a real name, only being referred to as Yoda's species, and without any detailed backstory from George Lucas either, only being introduced as a means to fill the teacher role for Luke following the death of Obi-Wan.
Help you again? Yes?
In the case of Grogu, this mystery has been exploited to conveniently mold him into whatever they feel suits the current needs of each scene of each episode, resulting in a character devoid of any true sense of progression or growth. But also in the case of Yoda, he trained for hundreds of years. He was a Jedi Master at age 96 and devoted an incredible amount of time to the Force. It was more than just being born with it. So now the question to ask is, why is Grogu forbidden from having a congruent, meaningful arc? Because when I search for an overarching narrative reason to explain what's going on here, I'm at a total loss. Instead, all I can see is that there appears to be some kind of biased determination to keep him cute because he's simply too cute to be allowed to grow up. And the dynamic between him and Din is too perfect as it is, so it must remain unchanged. And funnily enough, we have a rather poignant example of the problematic nature of attachment. In this case, the attachment comes from a place of cowardice on the part of the writers, to cling on to things as they are instead of letting their characters undergo their arc, leaving us with a contrived story instead of a natural one. One of the things that was so great about A Song of Ice and Fire, as seen in Game of Thrones Season 1, is how George R.R. Martin boldly killed off Ned Stark, because it was the way the winds were blowing in the narrative, and he still had a great story to tell without needing to cling on to characters. And in the case of Grogu, you didn't have to go nearly as far as actually killing him. So why is it so essential to portray Grogu as cute? Well, one of the things about cute things is they elicit an inner conviction to be protected and cared for in others, which essentially can then in turn be exploited for profit. And they even have a scientific blueprint to follow, so they can never go wrong. This is known as baby schema or infant schema, and it refers to a set of physical features that evoke an instinctual and nurturing response in humans. These features include a large head in proportion to the body, big round eyes, chubby cheeks, a small nose and mouth, and a soft, round body shape. And in the case of Grogu, a pink hue on the cheeks to boot. And you'd have to imagine that this conviction would be even more so in Favreau, who's responsible for not just the writing of the show, but also the initial idea of Grogu. And so there's something particularly cruel and treacherous in sabotaging the story of one of your own characters. But as we will look into, the decision may not have been his entirely. Anyway, they certainly nailed the formula perfectly, as Grogu's lifelike realness was so convincing. Werner Herzog described him as heartbreakingly beautiful, and in a moment of suspension of disbelief, even directed him during a scene. This illusion could be attributed in part to the dedicated puppeteers who continued to bring Grogu to life even when the cameras weren't rolling, leading the cast and crew to treat him as a real baby. And this adoration was present amongst the fandom too, particularly those who were introduced to Star Wars because of him, leading to Grogu inadvertently becoming the new face of the franchise, overshadowing what was supposed to be Rey's place. Grogu's presence and tomfoolery also played a significant role in generating ads for Disney. These came in the form of memes and compilations featuring Grogu on YouTube and TikTok, which have racked up millions of views, sometimes amounting to more than the show itself. And when it comes to how he looks on screen, you can't lose. Animations look good and smooth? Good, it gives him immersive, lifelike realism. But there are, however, cases where the animatronics and practical effects seem insufficient and don't look good, such as the animated scenes of him running and jumping, where he looks like a ragdoll being thrown around. But it doesn't matter that it looks bad, because that's part of its memeable charm. So either way, you just can't lose, and don't have to bother spending money on expensive CGI. This cuteness even garnered widespread acclaim in the media too, with The Guardian calling Grogu 2019's biggest new character, and The Hollywood Reporter saying he represents the future of Hollywood. Google Trends continue to reflect the sensation, as the search term Baby Yoda ranked as the second highest search term relating to the show at its launch. Prior to Grogu, things were looking bleak on the toy sales front, as sales were in a stubborn decline since 2016 due to the lack of interest in the new films, and any product that was sold was merchandise related to the original trilogy instead of the new trilogy. And even in the wider market, 2020 saw a falling year for Hasbro, as the company's sales of its licensed content from entertainment studios fell 12% to $1.08 billion for the full year. However, thanks to Grogu, the same period saw a 70% rise in the sales of Star Wars merchandise. And of course, Grogu's unexpected success surely constitutes much of the reason The Mandalorian and its associated stories, Boba Fett and the upcoming Ahsoka TV series, will culminate in an Avengers Union-style film release in a production written by Dave Filoni. However, this honeymoon period eventually petered out following the Book of Boba Fett as supply began to overtake demand and Grogu toys began gathering dust on the shelves. But the advent of Season 3 of The Mandalorian saw a rallying push to reinvigorate the craze, depicting Grogu antics aplenty, from spinning in the office chair to stealing sweets, being infantilized by celebrity appearances, and taking joy in the simple pleasures of life. This can now supply us with the other part of the reasoning as to why go through such significant screen time to put Grogu in Droid IG-11. Well, because it fits the M criteria. That is, it is both memeable and merchandisable, in that it warrants the release of distinct new lines of merchandise for fans to add to their collections. And the same applies to Grogu's acquisition of new armor pieces too. This means that each new season of The Mandalorian can be eventized with a new upgraded line of Grogu merch that's cooler and more adorable than seeing him in the same shabby brown rags forever. Now, having shows and films as a means to drive merchandise sales is nothing new. Many animated series exist for just this purpose, but generally it doesn't come at the cost of jeopardizing the entire story. But perhaps given the failure of the recent Star Wars movies, this approach was looked to as a low-risk, monetizable cash cow to compensate for their losses. Because cuteness is something that can be monetized with a high degree of certainty. With this, we have the other reason why I am incredibly doubtful we will see Baby Yoda fall to the dark side. Because evil Grogu instantly loses much of its cute appeal, which would negatively impact the sales of merchandise. And so, in lieu of a narrative reason to explain the story of Grogu, it seems we have found a reason that makes a whole lot more sense. Because how do you keep a baby cute forever? Have them never grow up. What we are witnessing unfold is how social media can affect the landscape of TV and film thanks to the power of memes and clips. In isolation, that's all good fun, but there's a certain tipping point where greed can ruin it all. And that's what we're witnessing in the case of The Mandalorian. It's an interesting precedent that modern stories might not actually be about the underlying story, but about memeing your way into viewers. And honestly, the way things are looking for Star Wars, it seems the entire franchise in the hands of Disney hangs on the thread of Grogu memes. But just how greedy will they get? The next test will be when the next mainline sequel films hit the big screen. It seems incredibly likely Grogu will make an appearance, but will he still be Baby Yoda by then? Favreau claimed Baby Yoda will learn to talk sooner rather than later, but he stated that prior to Season 3 airing. So surely the time will come eventually where some kind of irretractable growth will finally occur, perhaps one word at a time. For the time being, it seems Grogu is heading towards becoming a fully fledged Mandalorian, but with the integration of the Force. Maybe forging his own dark saber and taming the mythosaur. And when the time comes, connecting with Rey in some way, perhaps finding each other with the Force. While this decked out version of Grogu will create a merchandisable event, a more matured Grogu also means a new multi-million-dollar animatronic puppet too. And with this growth also comes the demand for a more animated Grogu. And animations like walking, jumping, and fighting are more complex and expensive than having him being carried around like a doll. But such a thing certainly doesn't seem to be on the horizon anytime soon. What we've learnt from all of this is that anything can happen, and not for the reason that there's genius writing at play, but that it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense, as any liberty can be taken to put whatever they want on screen. Whether it be legacy characters, celebrity appearances, action sequences, or cute memeable moments. This results in a narrative that isn't really a narrative at all, but more of an incongruent stitching together of scenes to form a sort of compilation of moments, where the narrative goes no deeper than surface level. There's no story in the sense that there's no learning, no growth, no respect for past events that should be shaping characters. Given this effort to do what looks good on screen immediately instead of respecting the overall narrative, Season 3 of The Mandalorian shows us that they've now written themselves into a corner, where Grogu looks very much without purpose. If Grogu doesn't have a means to overcome his traumas and fears, what's the actual story to tell? If he's already made the decision to take the easy road and live for transitory pleasures, where's the ideal? How can he be deserved of attaining to anything as a Mandalorian? Does he just get everything he wants without having to learn any lessons? And the fact that this character is the face of Disney's Star Wars makes that all even worse. Whether or not you find The Mandalorian worth watching comes down to a question of what you look for in your viewing experience. If you're looking to switch off your brain, not think about what you're watching and just have something play in the background, you might tune in. Or if you like memeable moments, the occasional decent action sequence, or just the aesthetic of it, then sure, why not? There's nothing wrong with liking what you like. I will admit that in isolation, the sequence of Grogu being a rascal causing shenanigans after first getting IG-11 was a rather funny and apt depiction of a new parent looking after their toddler. But really, this is something that can be enjoyed and appreciated in isolation only. Because if you're watching in the hope of getting a well-written story, the outlook is looking bleak, as it seems to have long since abandoned any effort in that regard. When it comes to the writing of The Mandalorian, the story of Grogu and Mando was a case of die a hero or live long enough to become a villain. It's a story of too cute to fail in terms of widespread appeal, devilishly morphing into too cute to succeed from a narrative perspective, because they just got too greedy.